Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we are discussing the right to freedom of expression and the right to protest vile things. Now, Ryan, I don't think that we can put a prior restraint on protests. We can't preemptively say this protest can't take place because it may have criminal elements, or I don't like what the protest is saying. But obviously, crimes can occur at protests. What might police be watching for when they're observing protests like this? Like
Well,
these
and just as I was
Hamas
mentioning in the last
supporting protests.
just as I was mentioning in the last segment, just because we might vehemently disagree with the content of what people are chanting on the street, it doesn't make it criminal. It doesn't make it illegal, and we shouldn't be preventatively banning individuals from expressing themselves, no matter what those ideas are. We don't know what those ideas are going to be ultimately expressed at those protests, and we already have laws to address what people might say is problematic elements of protest. If someone is assaulted at a protest, that violence is prohibited under the criminal code. If someone, riots or engage in property destruction, that's prohibited under the provisions regarding mischief in the criminal code. So we already have a large suite of laws available to law enforcement to address some of the problems that we see arising from overexcited individuals at protests. But simply banning protests because they might support a particular political perspective or support Hamas or Palestinian statehood, it's an affront to our Constitution, and we already have laws to deal with it. And I would object to, and I think most reasonable people ought to object to, any sort of prior restraint on the content of protests. It's not in the spirit of our Constitution, and it's not something that we should promote.
Josh, your reaction to that? What types of things might police be concerned with about protests when we know our Constitution would not permit us to prohibit protests on the basis of the subject matter? And frankly, I wouldn't want it to. I don't think it should. We should counter speech we disagree with better speech or better facts or more accurate facts. But crimes can take place at protests. What might police be looking for?
Well, in addition to some of those examples that Ryan gave, like, where it turns into a riot or there's violence, there are also some restrictions on speech. For example, there's incitement to genocide, and that's an extremely rarely used provision of the criminal code. But if you are, for example, going to a rally and saying, this particular group of people is, subhuman, and let's go get this group of people and take them out, essentially, or do something genocidal towards them, there is a provision there that can be used if police get the permission of the Attorney General. There's also other provisions that can be used. For example, possibly the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. And while I want to make very clear that I don't think anyone should be deported for their political views, that act does allow permanent residents or non-Canadian citizens to be deported if they are a security threat or if they support a terrorist group. So there are a number of laws that can be used at protests if people are supporting terrorism.
Yeah, my concern is there's some ambiguity in what it means to support terrorism, and I don't think chanting from the river to the sea, even though I do think that is a genocidal call, I don't think they would necessarily meet the threshold to use that criminal law provision that you've mentioned, Josh, or meet the threshold for materially supporting terrorism. I think you would require more than that, something perhaps like providing financial assistance to a terrorist organization like Hamas. Now, I want to make something clear. I don't want to conflate protests in support of Palestinian statehood or independence with support for the atrocities committed by Hamas. I think that these are distinct things. I think that there's a lot of things that happen at protests. Protests are messy and complicated. But I want to get both of your take, perhaps not legally, because this isn't a legal question, but perhaps culturally, on when a protest wanders from supporting statehood or independence into supporting the atrocities that were perpetrated on that October morning. And I think to me, a protest immediately following the massacre before Israel had even responded, I think to me that the way culturally I would interpret that is a clear sign of support for the massacre. But now that there's a full out crisis in the region, I think we can't fairly characterize everyone at these protests as sympathizing with the massacre. Now, that's my question I'm posing to you. We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back to answer that question.